Okay. Well, that's the lamp, not the microphone. Okay. And that's the microphone. Welcome. Good afternoon. I'm Richard Grusin, Director of the Center for 21st Century Studies. And you're especially lucky to be here in this room because only in this room will you get the full audio effect of Ed Shanken's presentation, since the live stream is being very kludgy. So in any case, you're lucky to be here. So before I will turn over the mic in just a second to Nathaniel Stern, who will introduce Ed. But first I wanted to begin, as we always do, by acknowledging that here in Milwaukee, we live on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homelands along the southwest shores of Michigami, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes. On these lands, the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnick rivers meet, and the human and non-human people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. We're grateful to live and work alongside all of the diverse inhabitants of this place. Thanks. Before I turn this over to Nathaniel Stern, I wanted just to extend an invitation to you to join us up on the 9th floor of Curtin Hall for a reception afterwards, and to remind you of a couple of events we have coming this month. Next Thursday, February 20th at 3 p.m. in the American Geographical Society Library, Maxwell Woods will be talking about the current situation in Chile. And then on Friday, February 28th, Courtney Baker will be here doing a brown bag seminar up in 939 on, is that the one on, the lectures on Selma? I'm not a Negro. Right, I'm Not a Negro, James Baldwin, the film of Baldwin's novel, and then at 3:30 she'll be talking about the film Selma, so please join us for those. Thanks. So I'm happy to turn this over to my friend and colleague, Nathaniel Stern.
Thanks, Richard. Hey, everybody. How's it going? Don't answer that. It's rhetorical. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Ed Shanken for his lecture, Deus ex Poiesis, a manifesto for the end of the world and the future of art and technology. Eddie is a fascinating theorist and historian who's explored the relational aspects of interactive and digital art. When he edited the collection Telematic Embrace, Visionary Theories of Art, Technology, and Consciousness for UC Press, he later wrote a beautiful monograph about art and electronic media for Phaidon. More recently, he edited a book on system-based art for Whitechapel and has been exploring techno-shamanism and art-science collaboration, surveillance culture, sound art, and ecology systems theory, and the bridging of the gap between new media and contemporary art. We were talking about this last night. I first introduced myself to Eddie at the International Symposium on Electronic Art in 2012, but that was only because I was too shy to introduce myself to him when I saw him give a profoundly performative lecture at the International Symposium on Electronic Art in 2010 in Germany, where he was claiming that Nicolas Bourriaud was like completely ignoring interactive art and with relational aesthetics and digital art, and he got it all wrong. He himself is an associate professor of digital art and new media at UC Santa Cruz. I'm thrilled to have him here in Milwaukee, both for his talk here at UWM and the panel around my exhibition tomorrow at 2 p.m. at the St. Kate Hotel downtown. Oh yeah, did I mention the panel at 2 p.m. tomorrow and my exhibition at the St. Kate Hotel? You should go. Today, Shanken will perform, as I know he often does, what he calls a manifesto and a call to action. He begins with this gloomy scenario and the common hope that art can help rescue us from self-destruction. He argues that our culture, overemphasizes scientific rationalism and that our survival demands that we develop other abilities. The fundamental question is, what can art and artists do that will ensure that there is a bright future on Earth for all beings? And this is the part I'm excited about, a critique of academia. leads to a reconsideration of the trope of artists as radar and the role of poiesis in overcoming technological enframing. He talks about a number of artists and thinkers to make his points. It's great to have you here. Let's hear for Dr. Professor Shanken. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard Grusin, for introducing me also. It's an honor to be here. I've admired your work and taught it to my students for years. Thank you, Nathaniel, for the invitation to be here, and thank you for the co-sponsors at the Center for 21st Century Studies and the Digital Humanities who've also hosted me here. Nathaniel has given me this gift of a beautiful 10 by 10 hardbound exhibition catalog. And I just wanted to give him a little gift of a roughly 7 by 9 inch softbound copy of my book, Systems, as a small exchange. We have a nice history of exchange. When I saw this image, sporadical, on Instagram in April 2019, I was really like, I love this image. I wrote right to Nathaniel, I love this image. I want to live with it. And so it just so happened he was coming to my neck of the woods in Santa Cruz. He was in San Jose. And I was given a gift of this 5-foot print. And the scale matters for an image like this. And so I got to live with it. And through the process of living with it, I generated a poem that graces this exhibition catalog, and it's really kind of the first thing you see here. So, well, it's like this. So I wanted to thank Nathaniel for giving me the opportunity to write about this work that so profoundly inspired me. And I must say that whenever people come to my home and they see this work, they are really taken by it. It's a tremendous conversation starter. And I keep learning from it by looking at it and sharing it with others. And as you'll see, another mushroom image is central to my presentation. And I'll get to that in a minute. I'd like to dedicate this talk to one of my heroes, the art historian and critic Jack Burnham, who also figures in my talk. And he died 349 days ago. He was a pioneering, trailblazing historian and critic of art and technology. And his work continues to inspire artists and theorists. It's remarkable how it continues to resonate so compellingly. So, as Nathaniel mentioned, my talk begins with a gloomy scenario. And it's really a manifesto, a call to action. Begins with this gloomy scenario and the common hope that art can help rescue us from self-destruction, us being humans and other species that are rapidly being despeciated from the world as a result of our interventions in it. I argue that our culture overemphasizes scientific rationalism and that our survival as a species and that of other species demands other abilities. The fundamental question is, what can art and artists do that will ensure that there is a bright future on Earth for all beings? Okay, so here's another mushroom image. In 1952, the US tested the first full-scale hydrogen bomb, Ivy Mike. It was some 700 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima in 1945. The following year, the Soviet Union tested its first thermonuclear device. These events triggered the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists to advance the doomsday clock to 2 minutes before midnight, the closest it had ever been to nuclear Armageddon. This is Martel Langsdorff, the designer of the doomsday clock, and I'll just run a quick video.
This is the doomsday clock. It was designed back in 1947 by artist Marta Langsdorff, and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists sets the clock to show how much time we have left until midnight. Midnight in this case meaning nuclear Armageddon and the end of humanity. In January 2017, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists revealed that the clock ticked 30 seconds closer than last year to the end of times, and cited, among other things, climate change, cybersecurity, nuclear weapons, and Donald Trump as causes.
So that was 2.5 minutes before nuclear midnight in 2017. In 2018, it advanced to 2 minutes before midnight for many of the same causes. In 2019, it was still at 2 minutes to nuclear midnight. Can anyone guess what time it is now? 30 seconds. That's a good guess in the right direction. 100 seconds to nuclear midnight. 100 seconds before the end of the world as we know it. And if it were not bad enough that we were measuring this in terms of minutes away, now we're measuring it in terms of seconds away. Okay, Deus ex machina to Deus ex poiesis, art as a cure for technology. In the mid-1950s, while the US and the USSR were competing to make the biggest, baddest bombs, philosopher Martin Heidegger wrote The Question Concerning Technology. Now, this is a book with that title, but it's an essay. He noted that man stands so decisively in subservience to technological enframing that he fails to see himself as the one spoken to. It has already afflicted man in his essence. Please pardon the gender-exclusive pronouns. So he argued, however, that art offers hope for overcoming technology's dehumanizing effects. So whereas technology threatens revealing and radically endangers the relation to the essence of truth, he argues that the fine arts are called to poetic revealing and possess a saving power that shines forth in the midst of the extreme danger. I'd like to share a few more examples of artists and intellectuals' belief in the, for lack of a better term, saving grace of art. So Jack Burnham, who I mentioned before, observed that with increasing aggressiveness, one of the artist's functions is to specify how technology uses us. Again, this revealing function. Cybernetician, polymath, anthropologist Gregory Bateson, who at one time taught at UC Santa Cruz, where I'm a professor, has written, mere purposive rationality, unaided by such phenomena as art, religion, dream, and the like, is necessarily pathogenic and destructive of life. Its virulence springs specifically from the circumstance that life depends upon interlocking circuits of contingency, while consciousness can see only short arcs of such circuits as human purpose may direct. More recently, composer David Dunn, who was a professor emeritus now at UC Santa Cruz, has suggested that music might serve a unique evolutionary function that can provide us with clues to our continued survival. So, in ancient Greek and Roman theater, the device of the Deus ex machina, God from the machine, marked the appearance, suspended from a crane often, of a godlike figure that resolved an apparently imperiled dilemma. This dramatic device continues to be used in dramatic narratives in television and cinema. It happens all the time. At the last moment, something powerful, a monster, an alien, a new drug, a superhero, whatever it is, suddenly appears out of nowhere to save someone, to save humanity itself from a life-threatening situation. I interpret Heidegger's argument as a form of Deus ex machina. Just when it appears that technology has afflicted humanity in its essence, threatens revealing, and radically endangers the relation to the essence of truth, Poiesis comes to the rescue. The fine arts are called to poetic revealing and possess the saving power that shines forth in the midst of extreme danger. So Poiesis functions as a deus ex machina for Heidegger in the question concerning technology. And that's why I call it Deus ex Poiesis. Now, in the past, I've dismissed Heidegger's argument as irrational. I don't really see any logical justification for making this claim. It's kind of, he calls on the etymology of poiesis and ars and all these things and techne. But I don't think it's a really rational argument. But I'd like to entertain that maybe there's something to it. What if there is something to it? Maybe there's something right about that. And just because something's irrational doesn't mean that it's wrong. So I'm going to begin with the premise that maybe we should entertain this prospect that art can offer some means of salvation from the ills of technology. Not that technology is, as Richard Grusin above all, could be seen as this autonomous actor, right? But that the ways in which technology possesses some sort of agency could be countermanded in some way through the operations of art. Okay, so this is one of the parts that Nathaniel's really interested in, the problem with academia. The problem with academia is, well, it's just too darn academic. And I'm as guilty of academicism as anyone. And I'm trying to heal myself from many years of training and professional activity that has cultivated rigorous analytic thinking, this left brain hyper-rationality, to the detriment of other forms of knowing and understanding. I believe that I have become out of balance, and academia is out of balance. Its intellectual brilliance and bravura does little to develop vital abilities that may be necessary for long-term survival. So it overemphasizes scientific rationality. It inadequately cultivates certain types of sensitivity, empathy, and, well, here on Valentine's Day, love. It keeps its subject at a distance. The idea of objectivity is fundamental to many practices in science and criticism, although that's beginning to erode. And I believe that it impairs having an open heart. And if we don't have an open heart, we can't really have an open mind. It impairs our ability to have kinship with all beings, not just with other human beings. But it's hard enough to have kinship with other human beings, as we can see from global politics, or even within domestic politics. And I think that it impairs our ability to accept things, to accept realms beyond reason and logic. So as Mary Catherine Bateson, the brilliant anthropologist and daughter of Gregory Bateson, has written in her book, Our Own Metaphor, to learn to love, we would need to recognize ourselves as systems, the beloved as systemic, similar, and lovely in complexity, and to see ourselves at the same time as merged in a single system with the beloved. I'm going to be teaching a course on environmental art, a studio course in the spring, and my premise for this course stems from this sort of systemic thinking, connecting to love and opening one's heart. And the premise for the course is that if we're going to make environmental art that's really going to have some impact, it has to somehow resonate so compellingly with others that it compels them to take action. We must open our hearts to the earth sufficiently in order to compel ourselves and compel others to take action to protect it. In order to do that, we have to open our hearts sufficiently to ourselves, because the extent to which we can open our hearts to others is contingent upon the extent to which we can open our hearts to ourselves. Did I say that right? Open our hearts to others, contingent upon how much we can open our hearts to ourselves. And the extent to which we can open our hearts to the earth is contingent upon these other contingencies, opening our hearts to others, opening our hearts to ourselves. So, for some reason, despite our keen rational minds and extraordinary technologies, I wonder, are we capable of loving ourselves and our beloved enough to protect our shared ecosystems on Earth and Gaia from impending global warming, nuclear, cyber apocalypse? And if not, what's wrong with us? And how can art help? Again, I'll turn to Gregory Bateson, who uses this wonderful word wisdom, something that I don't even know how to define it, but maybe we have a sense of what it is or what it could be. He says that if art has a positive function in maintaining what I called wisdom, in correcting or rebalancing a too purposive view of life and making the view more systemic, then the question becomes, what sorts of correction in the direction of wisdom would be achieved by creating or viewing this work of art? And I think that it's in that sense that I admire so much Nathaniel's image, sporadical. There's something in it that invokes some sort of sensitivity to our scale and the scale of other things and the scale of time. Artist's radar. This is a notion of Marshall McLuhan and Jack Burnham's idea of a psychic dress rehearsal for the future. So in the midst of the Cold War in the 1950s, the US and Canada built the distant early warning line known as the DEW line. This was a system of radar stations to detect incoming Soviet bombers in the event of a nuclear attack. Canadian media theorist McLuhan famously used the DEW line as a metaphor for the role of artists in society. As he wrote in 1964, I think of art at its most significant as a DEW line, a distant early warning system that can always be relied on to tell the old culture what is beginning to happen to it. Similarly, Burnham thought of art as a psychic dress rehearsal for the future. So let's presume that Heidegger and the others are right, or at least they're onto something, as I've said. In light of the precarity of the future of the certain life on Earth, what role might art and artists play in pushing the doomsday clock back to less threatening levels? How can art correct an overly purposive mindset and promote a more systemic perspective? How can art expand our ability to be open to and to accept things outside the realm of reason and logic? What sorts of systemic wisdom can it impart that will cultivate sensitivity, empathy, and love? In what ways does art prepare us for the future? So these are questions, but they could also be made into assertions. In other words, art must play a role in pushing the doomsday clock back to less threatening levels. Art must correct an overly purposive mindset and promote more systemic perspectives. Art must expand our ability. Art must impart wisdom that cultivates sensitivity, empathy, and love. Art must prepare us for the future. So I'll give you one of my favorite examples of how artists prepare us for the future, envision it, and give us kind of a taste of it in the present. And we'll actually look at some art. Roy Ascott is my favorite example of an artist who envisioned the future and created artistic models that enabled us to sample it in the present. In 1983, he realized a seminal work of art called La plissure du texte, and he called this new art form telematic art. Telematic art uses computer networking systems like the internet as its medium, just as artists in the past have used charcoal, paint, wood, marble, and so forth as media. La plissure was a collaborative online storytelling project. It joined artists in 11 cities around the globe via computer networking. Each node took on its own role, its own identity, the wizard, the messenger, the princess, and so forth. Together, they collectively wrote what Ascott called a planetary fairy tale. And the artist experienced a sort of collective consciousness that emerged among the participants in the process of this emerging tome. And this unfolding narrative is something that is hard to imagine emerging from any single mind. It was more like a surrealist exquisite corpse, that game where you might start a drawing and then end it and fold it over, and just the end becomes the beginning for the next person to add on to, and then it's folded over again, and that's repeated several times until finally you get an image that no single mind could have possibly imagined. So the technology in 1983 was really primitive by today's standards. It used like handsets with rubber modem housings and 300 baud modem rates, but it didn't matter. It was restricted to ASCII characters, but you can make images with ASCII characters. Nonetheless, this telematic artwork offered participants an unprecedented opportunity to experience forms of role-playing, virtual presence, hive mind, and crowdsourcing that are hallmarks of social media and participatory culture since the mid-2000s. In other words, in 1983, Ascott provided us with a psychic dress rehearsal for the future that enabled us to experience forms of communication and sociality that have become key features of contemporary culture several decades later. Ascott's utopian aspirations parallel the euphoric rhetoric that proliferated at the advent of the World Wide Web in the mid-90s. However, the internet is a double-edged sword, as I think we all know. The timekeepers of the doomsday clock identified the misuse of information technology and the vulnerabilities of democracy to disinformation, as we saw in the 2016 US presidential election, as major contributors to global precarity. Yet, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists also identifies opportunities for resistance that may be well suited to artists' use of media. As they wrote, there is a flip side to the abuse of social media. Leaders react when citizens insist they do so, and citizens around the world can use the power of the internet to improve the long-term prospects of their children and grandchildren. They can insist on facts and discount nonsense. They can demand action to reduce the existential threat of nuclear war and unchecked climate change. They can seize the opportunity to make a safer and saner world. In the late 1990s, artists began using the internet as a medium for interventions that had real-world impact on governments and corporations. They became digital activists and online guerrillas. Such forms of electronic civil disobedience include tactical media, hacktivism, and culture jamming. I'll give you a couple examples. In 1998, the Electronic Disturbance Theater's FloodNet program deployed a distributed denial of service, a DDoS attack, to flood Mexican government websites until the overload crashed the servers. So the way this works basically is you keep pinging the server over and over again, rapidly, and it just becomes overwhelmed and it crashes. This work of hacktivism was a response to the Acteal massacre in December of '97. And the Electronic Disturbance Theater project drew attention to the Zapatista cause and to the violent actions of the Mexican government against its people. Artmark was founded in the 1990s, and that's on the right side, as an activist consulting firm. Two successful campaigns during 99-2000 include one, defending the European artist group eToy from a court injunction filed by internet toy vendor eToys over rights to the domain etoy.com, and two, defending the journal Leonardo, which is the premier journal at the intersections of art, science, and technology, from a lawsuit filed by Leonardo Finance, which was disgruntled because the magazine, which was founded in 1968, turned up higher in search engine results than the French financier. Amidst Artmark's culture jamming strategies, eToy's stock price plummeted, as you see in this graph here, and the case was dropped. The Leonardo strategy produced a plethora of protest websites, creating an even more competitive environment for search engine results for Leonardo Finance, whose suit was dismissed by the court. More recently, the Critical Engineering Manifesto asserts that any technology depended upon is both a challenge and a threat. The greater dependence on a technology, the greater the need to study and expose its inner workings, regardless of its ownership or legal provision. And this transparency grenade can be put in any sort of space where a meeting's taking place, and you pull the plug, and it records what's going on, and it intercepts any internet traffic, and it broadcasts it. So it creates transparency about what's happening in private. It's also kind of a beautiful object. Other work by Julian Oliver in collaboration with Danja Vasiliev, their work Prism, the Beacon Frame, reveals cellular telephone network vulnerabilities that have been exploited by government agencies to spy on people, and speculated on the NSA's Prism surveillance technology. The artwork impersonates local cellular service providers so that the phones in the presence of Prism's, the artwork's tower, will hop onto the rogue network, believing that it's a trustworthy cellular provider. Unwitting audience members whose phones have been hijacked by the network are sent SMS messages of a, quote, troubling, humorous, and/or sardonic nature, such as, "Welcome to your new NSA partner network," or "Spying Reform 2014, Embrace Our Transparency." This artwork was taken down when it was exhibited in 2014 at Transmediale because the venue believed that it was in violation of German privacy laws, which may very well have been the case. But they made their point, and as usual, when censors take action, they really help the cause, oftentimes. Artists will continue to play a vital role in exploring alternative futures and creating working models that enable us to preview what is to come. They will also become more sophisticated in their strategic use of electronic media to protest governments, to subvert corporate malfeasance, doing bad things, to question and subvert surveillance, and to draw attention to the hidden vulnerabilities in widespread consumer technologies. Future artists will use technologies, as they have been for years, in ways that pervert technological correctness, to use Rafael Lozano Hemmer's term. And he used this term, I think, in 1996 in the context of an online exhibition he curated for the journal Leonardo that was targeted by Leonardo Finance. So that is to say, in terms of perverting technological correctness to misuse technologies in order to subvert the corporate or governmental ideologies and agendas that underlie them. Art will increasingly turn technology in on itself, or even turn it against itself. Rather than we humans being the ones spoken to quote Heidegger, by technology, it will speak to itself and to us, and artists will make this turn. And it will do this in ways that reveal how technology is deeply embedded, imbricated in modes of perception, knowledge production, surveillance, policing, economics, and social life. That function of revealing that Heidegger claimed for Poiesis. Alongside these trajectories, the growing trend of transdisciplinary research, collaborations joining science, engineering, art, and design, abbreviated as SEAD, SEED, is playing an important role in humanizing technology, while at the same time generating breakthrough innovation. And I'm really honored to have Johannes here, a collaborator with Nathaniel on works in the exhibition, which I hope you'll all see.
Thanks.
Yeah. So we have in the audience here 2 members of an art-science collaboration. And I believe that the innovations that are generated by art-science collaborations extend beyond commercially viable products. They go beyond the purposive rationality that Bateson discussed. And embody more subtle, insidious, and profound shifts in perception and consciousness. They reframe how knowledge is constructed and how we live our lives. In the final section of my talk, I'd like to address some alternative technologies and shamanism. And my brown bag lunch today, I gave a sort of led a discussion on something I call techno-shamanism. The term isn't my term. I think the term is actually redundant because I consider, as many others do, shamanism as a form of technology. So over and above the sort of critical artistic engagements and collaborations that I've discussed, I believe that future artists will increasingly recognize the limits of technologies derived from scientific rationality, and will seek to develop and deploy alternative techniques that are derived from other systems of knowledge and being. They'll push beyond the limits of academic discourse and scientific rationalism. They will merge rational and super-rational forms of technology. And what I have in mind here are forms of knowledge, modes of perception, and states of consciousness cultivated through meditation, yoga, dance, and other forms of embodied movement, shamanism, and other mind-body technologies. Art is closely and has been closely allied with shamanism and healing in many cultural traditions. So in our struggle to overcome technological enframing, this fear that Heidegger identified in the 50s, why just limit our arsenal to art, as Heidegger proposed? Indeed, since the 50s, non-Western philosophies and practices have deeply impacted contemporary Western aesthetics and scientific practice and other forms of inquiry. I would like to entertain the idea that they have great potential for transforming consciousness in ways that can turn back the hands of the doomsday clock. I argue that the greatest challenges to protecting the planet are not technological. They are attitudinal and volitional. The citizens and governments of the world, maybe even the corporations, must open their hearts and minds to the kinship of all beings. And I use this term kinship informed by the work of Donna Haraway, who will make an appearance in a few minutes. Somehow we must harness empathy, responsibility, and the willpower to replace greed and exploitation with the collective practice of altruism on a global scale. We're listening now to a track called Suirin by Pauline Oliveros in the Deep Listening group. Pauline Oliveros joined art, science, and technology with various spiritual traditions in order to achieve expanded forms of consciousness. Indeed, expanded consciousness was the goal of her lifelong practice as a musician and composer. Through her intensive studies of Buddhism, meditation, Tai Chi, Qigong, martial arts, dream work, and of course, Western concert music and electronics, Oliveros developed a discipline and language of mind, body, energetic flow, and control. Like the techniques upon which she drew, her practice and pedagogy are designed to rebalance the body's complex systems and thus to promote health. And promoting health was alongside expanding consciousness, the other key goal of her praxis. Such balance and health at an individual level are perhaps a prerequisite to balance and health at the level of society. By 1970, Oliveros had begun writing the Sonic Meditations, which are landmarks in the history of music composition. The Sonic Meditations incorporated a wide range of practices, including telepathy and astral projection in the composition. This work continues to inspire composers and performers and is routinely reperformed. And often these performances take place from remote locations, and Pauline was an early proponent of telematic, remote, collaborative music performance. Just as Ascott used computer networking for telematic art, she used it for telematic live music performance. As music critic John Rockwell observed, quote, "On some level, music, sound, consciousness, and religion are all one, and Oliveros' work would seem to be very close to that level." End quote. And this is Pauline with her iconic accordion. That was her primary acoustic instrument in the back, with an all-female ensemble performing Sonic Meditations. Here's an example of how Oliveros joined these ideas with technology in a speculative way. So, in her essay, Quantum Improvisation, Oliveros lists the ideal attributes for a future artificial intelligence chip with which she could make music. They include the imaginable technical ability to calculate at speed and complexity that exceeds the human brain, as well as more abstract psychic abilities. These include the ability to understand the relational wisdom that comprehends the nature of musical energy, the ability to perceive and comprehend the spiritual connection and interdependence of all beings and all creation as the basis and privilege of music making, the ability to create community and healing through music making, the ability to sound and perceive the far reaches of the universe, much as whales sound and perceive the vastness of the oceans. And she suggests that this could set the stage for interdimensional galactic improvisations with yet unknown beings. In other words, this AI chip that she speculates about would actually do what she wanted to do as a musician without any computational media. I think that these are actually the goals of her Sonic Meditations and her other music practices after 1970. So if you can create an AI chip that could help her do that, she'd be really interested. But the sort of digital technologies we have now, it's hard to imagine them acceding to this kind of level of function. In fact, for many of us, it's probably hard to imagine this level of function existing in any way because it completely exceeds the rational. Oliveros's praxis bears striking affinities with shamanic rituals, which also influenced Ascott and many other artists. A shaman is a special individual, one who is partly self-selected and partly anointed by other shamans to play a unique role in the community. In some traditions, shamans are passed down through hereditary bloodlines. Sometimes they become shamans as a result of maybe near-death experiences from which they were able to heal themselves. And through that process of facing death and recovering from it, going into the other world and coming back, they learn how to heal others, how to move between worlds. The shaman is at once revered and feared because of their powers, which can both cure and harm. The shaman is both of this world and of the world beyond. The shaman communicates with spirits and ancestors in the beyond, learns from them, and brings that knowledge and wisdom back to this world in order to cure individuals and to protect and heal the community as a whole. The shaman can embody the consciousness of other beings, including other animals. And in some traditions, other animals have their own shamans. So human shamans and other jaguar shamans, for example, can meet and commune. Inspired by Korea's shamanic and Buddhist traditions, artist Jeong Kim created Birdman, a multimedia art installation. This artwork asks some fundamental questions. How do human beings conceptualize the world? Can the hybrid world of Birdman transform perception beyond the limits of human physiology? In this case, hybridizing human and avian perception. And if new perceptions create new metaphors, can the experience of another species' perceptual reality help create hybrid perspectives marked by greater empathy and ecological sensitivity? The concept of a hybrid Birdman appeared to Kim in a dream, which is often the source of shamanic revelations. Due to a traumatic experience in his childhood, Kim's fear of birds as an adult prevented him from helping a one-winged bird that was suffering and dying. He was racked by guilt. And with this guilt, he dreamed that he learned bird language from a monster with a bird head and only one wing. You see this in the installation. The dream and the artwork can thus be interpreted as an effort to attain catharsis through aesthetic and perhaps shamanic means. As Kim writes, in Korean tradition, some shamans can share their own bodies with the deceased soul. Whenever a shaman is possessed by the spirit of the dead, he or she acts, speaks, and senses like another person, as if borrowing the perception of the deceased. This moment looks like a coexistent state of the living body and the dead, in which the perception and identity of the two is hybridized. Birds have very different perceptual apparatus than we do. They see, I think, something like 120 frames per second. They have different field of view. So to join our perceptual ways of seeing with that of a bird could maybe expand our perception. And if we can expand our perception, maybe we can expand the metaphors by which we live. And if we can do that, then maybe we can live in more empathetic ways. Maybe we can turn back the hands of the doomsday clock. Kim explains that the Buddhist idea that the self is not different than the other. And that's another prevailing concept in Birdman. The work offers the audience an opportunity to experience a form of hybrid perception that joins human and avian qualia, which are the internal and subjective components of sense perceptions. It enables us to expand our consciousness beyond the limits of our embodied human minds by joining self and other. Human and other animal perceptions. And as a result of this, it creates new metaphors to live by and to live with. Such ideas echo Donna Haraway's ecofeminist theories of multi-species worlds. Haraway advocates a concept of kinship or making kin that joins all beings. She writes, "All earthlings are kin in the deepest sense. All critters share a common flesh. Who and whatever we are, we need to make with, become with, compose with." In other words, all beings, human and non-human, are collaborators in the process of the Earth's becoming. Indeed, the pressing and enduring concerns of nuclear war, global warming, and the abuses of technology demand that we expand our perceptual domain and expand the metaphors by which that emerge from the limits of our perceptions. To do so, we must summon the full power of poiesis and also harness non-Western and shamanic technologies. We must cultivate the elusive wisdom to correct a too purposive view of life. We must expand our metaphors and our means and channels of communication. If we want to have a future, the artists of the future cannot be digital flaneurs or even distant early warning systems. They must serve as beacons of hope and as active participants in reshaping the world and our relationship with it in kinship with other beings. Our psychic dress rehearsal for the future must embrace kinship and harmonious co-emergence with all beings. Today, there is no greater artistic calling, no greater aesthetic necessity than helping to turn back the hands of the doomsday clock to heal and preserve the earth for posterity. Thank you. If there's time, I'd be happy to entertain questions.
Very interesting talk, and I really enjoyed it, and total agreement with the whole rise of purposive rationality, and in theory we have seen a lot of reactions to it, from Heidegger to Michel Foucault, and but the flip side of non-purposive rationality is that, as we see in Heidegger's case himself, that the aesthetic discourses somehow have the power to carry you farther. So his sympathies with Nazism were precisely because his anti-purposive attitude, right? Same thing we see with Michel Foucault, who really thought the Khomeini's Iranian Revolution was some sort of an answer, not the development of the kind of modern state with kind of dry secularism, where there's they're only engineers of the soul, but there is no soul. So but that can also be taken. So aesthetic discourses, and we still see even today, they have the power to carry people. So how to kind of think of non-purposive attitudes without falling into this other ways of being, which in some ways goes back to tribalism or clannishness and things like that, which were also part of humanity in some ways, right?
Yeah. No, you raise it, I think, a really vital question. I don't think that we can go too far one direction or the other. I think that somehow these things need to be balanced. And it's that imbalance that I think is the problem. We can't rely just on, there's this wonderful Colbert skit, right? It's the truthiness skit, right? Where it's not about facts, he just knows it in his gut, right? And this was a parody of George W. Bush, right? And we see this even worse today, where you don't even have to feel it in your gut. You can just tweet whatever the hell you want, and it becomes true by you tweeting it over and over and over again and having enough of a blind constituency buying it as the truth and having it reinforced by Fox News. So, no, this is a real dilemma. And I don't know, I don't think there's an easy answer. I think that somehow we need to, have dialogue. And right now, one of the problems is we don't have dialogue. We have two different belief systems that don't seem to be able to communicate with each other. I'm just talking about in the US context. And we certainly have that going on internationally in other ways. So maybe the question is, how do we cultivate dialogue so that the things we feel that we know in our gut and the things that we can rationally make sense of that seem to, have some correspondence with measurable truth can meet and somehow communicate with each other. And maybe that's just partly the human dilemma. That's the dilemma that's played out in so many dramatic narratives. It's at the core of like Kirk and Spock in Star Trek, right? And somehow, in most of these narratives, it's some like ineffable human intuitive quality that Kirk is able to harness that saves the day. Sometimes Spock's rationality, without it, Kirk would be sunk, right? But somehow the two need to come together. And I think that's the beauty of Star Trek, that balance, that dance between the intuitive, and the rational, the gut and the intellect. Yeah.
So I guess where I'm coming from, the biggest thing I fear about this is what's stopping technology from absorbing. Like, you say shamanism, I really say the experts of the other world. What's stopping technology, and to a certain extent, like the accumulation / extractive / absorption, like abilities of capitalism. What's stopping that from really taking those traditions and then commodifying them to the point where they're powerless? Because the biggest thing I think, and I've talked to a few like traditional African practitioners in Milwaukee a few times, and I was telling them like the biggest thing I fear is that if this religion got bigger or this practice got bigger, it'll absorb just like Buddhism, Hinduism, like Taoism in the 70s and 60s, where it's just like you had a bunch of practitioners that were true in it, but in the end it just got absorbed. And now what do we see? We see kind of those spiritual shops selling things. We have not Indians, fake Indians, however you want to say it, like selling those practices to the point where the actual practitioners of it, like, we don't see any of that. We don't get any word of that or anything. What's stopping all those traditions from really being absorbed by technology?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything stopping them from being absorbed by technology or being absorbed by the capitalist machine that commodifies everything that can be bought and sold. And in fact, you see that happening. There's a brisk trade in ayahuasca tourism in Latin America that has significant impacts in the communities where The tourists are flooding to have their authentic shamanic ayahuasca experience, as if there is something that is an authentic, indigenous ayahuasca experience. That whole notion has been contested by many researchers because it's been hybridized over hundreds of years of colonization and exchange between indigenous and mestizo populations. Yeah, and I mean the term techno-shamanism, which is the name of a course I'm teaching this term, and the brown bag lunch that I led today, it's often applied to the rave scene. And so like rave culture at first was sort of underground, and then it became business. And then you have like these mega festivals, which are big business, like Burning Man. There's nothing that prevents commodification of things like this. But that's not to say that there aren't maybe some salutary effects of mainstreaming of certain ideas and practices. So for example, and I'm not going to say whether this is good or bad really, but I'll just give an example. In the 30s, there were a couple new syncretic religions that emerged in Brazil that use ayahuasca as a sacrament, Santo Daime and Unidade Vegetal, and they've become very popular. And I'm not saying whether or not this is good or bad, but many people find these practices to be salutary, that it enriches their lives, just as the people who participated in raves in the 80s and 90s, led by DJs, fueled by MDMA or ecstasy or other psychedelics, felt that they had a healing experience. They experienced a unity, they experienced a oneness, they experienced a dissolution of their ego boundaries in positive ways. So maybe it's not just a bad thing. Maybe there are some benefits to these practices being spread outside of some sort of esoteric circle. They can also be exploited in ways that can be dangerous. So there are many people leading shamanic ayahuasca ceremonies in Latin America that don't know what they're doing, that are not capable of leading people on a spiritual journey safely. And the source of the psychedelic, the plant medicine, there are many, many question marks. So I think that there are downsides, but maybe potential upsides too. I don't know how to navigate that. It's tricky. But I whatever can be exploited will be exploited. And that's why some people like to refer to the moment we're in not as the Anthropocene, but as the Capitalocene, because it's fueled not just by human individuals, it's fueled by this economic machine that has its own rapacious desire and needs that are sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So maybe if indeed people are able to have experiences that are salutary, that give them insights, that expand their consciousness, that expand their perceptions beyond the dictates of production, consumption, capitalist, rapacious desire, excavation, taking, and impart some sense of trying to balance, trying to give back. Maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing. I don't know.
Hi, thanks for the talk. If I could just expand on this last point that you were talking about, in the idea of the Capitalocene and the Anthropocene, the problem that I have with this idea of kinship and this whole point of come togetherness is this idea of how do we not lose track of the history of the thing. You know what I mean? Like, how can we be more aware of the genealogy of the doomsday clock in terms of like, we are turning to these indigenous practices, to those traditional and like alternative ontologies and epistemologies to address like those problems. But at the same time, I mean, those same ideas and alternatives were the ones that historically colonialism and imperialism and capitalism sought to destroy, like literally destroy. And as someone that comes from, I'm from Brazil, someone that comes from like a place that is a product of imperialism and colonialism, my feeling about this is like, why should we help? You know what I mean? Like, why we that are like, that were a target for the same rationality, that now are seeking our help to make do of global destruction, why should we help now? You know what I mean? Like, how can we understand kinship as a group of people that were, for most parts of our history, put aside of the idea of mankind in itself? So I guess I want to hear from you, like, how do you take into your account of kinship and come togetherness, this whole messiness as well of the human history, and if there is any way of escaping or to doing so, paying attention to reparations, or to like being more, in terms of reparations.
Wow, well, that's a big question, and it lies really outside my area of expertise. But I can certainly understand how lands and cultures that have been exploited, colonized, the earth that has been extracted from, all these violences that have been exacted in the name of empire. And then the empire comes back and says, oh, by the way, can you help us out? Because we're in deep doo-doo. Yeah, it's like, sorry. And I was really grateful, Richard, in your introduction, for paying tribute to the indigenous peoples of this area on whose land we are having this conversation. And I think ultimately we are all in this together. And we can't excuse the transgressions of the past. And certainly a lot could be done to make reparations for them, for the lands that were taken, for the people that were exploited, for the people that were essentially kidnapped, bought and sold, and exploited in order to create and export commodities. Yeah, a lot more could be done for that. But right now, we don't have a lot of time unless we manage to keep the temperature increase to below 2 degrees centigrade. There's going to be a chain reaction of events that's going to strike the world as a whole. And we see how already the world has become so interconnected in economic terms. And now we're really deeply interconnected in terms of climate, in ways that will be devastating, and that will be devastating in ways that, again, most severely hurt those who are the least able to help themselves, the poorest people. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done, and we need to, genuinely make apologies and make reparations, but really to lock arms together and set aside our differences and try to save the planet from climate change. And the Amazon is like the lungs of the planet. And yet in Brazil, the devastation, the deforestation continues at a dramatic pace, driven by, I guess, global demand for meat, for cheap protein. And a president who's willing to play along with those global forces. So I don't have an answer for these great, global political questions. But I think that we need to open our hearts to each other.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. So I think it's interesting that what you can see from the questions is that I think what people are struggling with, which is kind of the gambit of your talk, is how to make the connection between, on the one hand, this kind of really lovely, desirable, at least for me, shamanistic vision of people, of oneness, both with humans, but also humans and non-humans, et cetera, that you're advocating, like art, as how can art, or at least help to bring that about. And then the other part of your talk, which is like, we're fucked. How do we save the climate? How do we save the planet? And so forth. And you're kind of, the gambit, in a sense, of your talk is like, okay, if we could just all love each other and, have these kind of shamanistic experiences, make kin and so forth, that we somehow, in some, like, maybe shamanistic way or magical way, it might just change that. But and the way and what's interesting, just to sort of flesh that out a bit then, so I think that's what people are struggling with, it seems to me, because they keep saying, but what about capitalism? What about, And another way to sort of see how the talk addresses that is this idea of how do we, like, move the hands back? And I'm like, why don't we just hack the clock? How about, in a way, it's like kind of a technical thing. If that's what we're talking about, let's not worry about the shamanistic oneness. Let's just worry about how do you hack the clock. And by hacking the clock, I don't mean like a gimmicky way of just, going in and moving so people open their web page and see, oh yeah, it's 10 minutes to doomsday. Although that would be one thing. But actually, what I mean by hacking the clock is that that's a sort of, that would say, let's not focus on this kind of spiritual oneness, shamanistic aesthetic side. Let's focus on, getting resources out of the hands of the 1% and distributing them to everybody. Let's stop all the things that are putting us at risk in a more direct way. And I think that that's where I think people are struggling. So I guess the question I have, and as you say, I don't know, we're going to change that. And of course, I don't either, in a sense. And I'm not entirely convinced that having these moments, which I think also are incredibly valuable, these moments of kind of shamanistic oneness or these spiritual moments and so forth, I don't think that's going to do it. But I wonder if you could think about a talk that would defend that even in the face of the clock being now 100 seconds away, even in the face of the, thermometer being just a couple degrees away and so forth, I wonder if you could do a talk that could defend and articulate the value of this kind of other non-rational, non-scientifically rational way of thinking that you've been advocating, not because in some way we could never really understand it's going to fix that problem and hack the clock, but because it's valuable in and of itself. In other words, I would be much more interested, I think, in hearing you go down that path. It's a more dangerous path, almost perhaps a nihilistic one, but there could be ways to articulate the value of these things without imagining that somehow they will be able to solve these other problems there. So, I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but.
Yeah. Thank you.
You can take it as a comment and we can,
No.
Yeah.
or if you want.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by that because I had also troubles with the clock. And as a scientist, I know how can you turn the time back? It's not possible. We cannot unknow things, really. At least I have a hard time thinking that time moves forward. How can we move time back? Maybe art helps us to imagine what comes after 12. And imagine a time after the mayhem when we piece things together. Because how do we go backwards? Unknowing things is really hard for me to imagine, and I'm not a technocrat that thinks you can solve every problem with more knowledge, but it's 100 seconds. How do we avoid that it's 100 seconds away?
Well, historically, the doomsday clock, thank you for your question, the clock goes back and forth. It's not just always getting closer to nuclear midnight. So there can be changes. For example, if someone else is elected president in the US, that could precipitate the hands of the doomsday clock going back, because the sort of conflict that's precipitated with North Korea, with Trump at the helm, might be ameliorated to some extent. And I gave some examples. Well, I'll give you an example of not turning the clock back, but air pollution in Los Angeles in the 80s was much worse than it is today. So we have shown in this country the ability to regulate things in such a way that we can actually move the hands back.
But that was done through scientific rationality, was done through progressive politics and things like that. It wasn't done through, and don't get me wrong,
Yeah,
I'm like
yeah,
totally down
yeah,
with the shamanistic.
yeah.
But it wasn't done by
Yeah.
those kinds of.
Yeah, well, I hope in my talk I wasn't relying just on shamanism to come to the rescue. This isn't Deus ex shamanismo. It's
Richard, you're forgetting that. Politics haven't been rational in some time. Yeah.
Yeah. In California, we've actually been able to do some rational legislation that has effects. And we've been able to do that at a national level too. But lately, things have gone in a different direction. And hopefully in the future, we will be able to negotiate in a country, in a democratic country, that actually can respond to reason and not just tweets.
Do you see Trump as a kind of evil shaman? Great.
Maybe we should start drinking.
Yeah, I wouldn't call him a shaman. But there is this distinction made between shamans and sorcerers.
Yeah.
Shamans are guided by beneficent spirits that help heal, and sorcerers use their powers for their own ego self-gain. According to John Harner, neo-shaman, American neo-shaman, eventually those sorcerers are no longer served by the spirits. They won't help them anymore. I'm not sure I believe that. I think that maybe there are some malevolent spirits that will keep aiding those who are in their their ego pursuits.
Why don't we take this upstairs where we have some things to eat?
Okay.
And also drink.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, that sounds good. Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions and conversation.